Excellency and dear brother Goodluck Ebele Jonathan, President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, Excellencies, heads of state and government, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. President, let me begin by conveying the message of solidarity of the people and government of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia to you and through you to the people and government of the Federal Republic of Nigeria on the centenary of the amalgamation that brought together the then northern and southern protectorates that formed your great country, Nigeria. I would also like to express how I feel singularly honored and humbled to be amongst a distinguished panel of leaders, statesmen, and scholars to say a few things on a topic that squarely captures what I believe should be the most important priorities of our continent in the 21st century. I will keep my intervention brief by avoiding, as much as I can, overly academic renditions on the topics and by rather focusing on the silent, practical manifestations in Africa of the interplay between the concepts chosen for the conference. I will also say a couple of things about my country's experience in addressing the myriad challenges that we have faced in the light of the topic at hand. Let me therefore proceed by once again acknowledging the theme for the conference, Human Security, Peace and Development, Agenda for the 21st Century Africa. Is indeed fitting and appropriate reflect, as it does, the very challenge that we have faced as a continent for decades on end and will continue to tackle not just at the level of individual countries, but more importantly at the level of the continent as a whole. The history of Africa for the better part of the last many centuries was largely a record of an almost laundry list of violence, deprivation, and bad governance visited upon the continent and its people through a multitude of agents. Africa has for centuries found itself at the receiving end of injustice, with its people constantly subjected to all kinds of senseless violence imaginable, be it through slave trade, colonialism, and neo-colonialism, or of late, through neoliberal economic orthodoxies that wrought unparalleled havoc on the continent and its people. Whether in the context of the inter- and intra-state wars repeatedly unleashed, famines that regularly occurred, or on account of bad policies that did come and go in quick succession, the common thread that runs through the history of Africa was the rather disheartening narrative of hopelessness and loss of lives of millions throughout the continent. Africa's predicament in the last few centuries could be safely described in terms of pervasive violence and insecurity, rampant conflict and war, and extreme deprivation and abject poverty. Or in a word, as the theme of the conference aptly captures it, Africa's predicament has for the most part been about the absence of or otherwise of human security or peace and, of course, economic development. If Africa is to cast off this once seemingly immutable image of hopelessness and violence, as I am sure it should, and in fact there is very reason to believe that it indeed will, its leaders must square off with this very challenge that many had the audacity to consider the continent's permanent features. The topics are very relevant because they remind us of the huge responsibility we have as a continent to take stock of the question of human security, peace and development in Africa. Whatever the academic and ideological hair splitting surrounding the topic, however, it's critical that we realize how interconnected or interrelated these three concepts are. Whatever the mostly academic and sometimes ideological definitions, notwithstanding, any discussion about human security as opposed to traditional notion of national security will invariably go beyond the rather narrow reference to the vulnerability of individuals to violence emanating out of conflicts. As it is clearly outlined in the UNDP's report on human security, the phrase in its broadest sense embraces far more than the absence of violent conflict. It encompasses human rights, good governance, access to education and health care, and ensuring that each individual has opportunities and choices to fulfill his or her own potential, freedom from want, freedom from fear, and the freedom of the future generations to inherit a healthy natural environment. If people still suffer from preventive disease or die of starvation, even in apparently the most peaceful of situations, the fact will still remain that the basic human security are far from met. So, ensuring human security in the context of our continent is about addressing the myriad challenges of Africans have faced for decades on end, which are not only questions of development, and they certainly are also the heart of many civil wars and conflicts throughout the continent, past and present. Lack of sustenance of life, food insecurity, abject poverty, lack of education and health and other social services, chronic unemployment, to mention but few, are what caused the untold human suffering that Africa has undergone and still undergoes in some respects. Whatever our ideological orientations or which school of thought in this debate we may subscribe to, one thing we can agree, at least in the context of Africa, is that our failure to address the most of these challenges, hence our propensity to conflicts, has mostly to do with issues of governance, mainly as pertains to allocation of resources. The source of many conflicts in Africa has mainly to do with the presence of, to borrow a phrase from Francis Stuart, horizontal inequality within a polity, be it political, economic, or social. That this inequality helps breed conflicts, and the prevalence of conflict further aggravates the myriad source of insecurity, both human as well as national. At the risk of sounding simplistic, the only way we Africans can break this vicious cycle is through improving our governance structures. While there is no one-size-fits-all ideological blueprint to get this process right, there appears to be a growing consensus that all-inclusive political arrangement is an absolute imperative. The whole notion of introducing all-inclusive political arrangement in any given system meant to address these historical inequalities could only make sense if this political experiment also at the same time involves putting in place policies that could ensure sustainable economic development benefiting the cross-section of society irrespective of ethnicity, gender, political affiliation, or class. In essence, addressing a deadly conflict between two groups in a society arising out of many real or perceived inequalities among them is the first and foremost about addressing the political system that made the inequality possible in the first place. Political arrangements alone, however well-intentioned they might be, cannot address inequalities on their own, but they are the necessary, albeit not sufficient conditions for any functioning system. This is about rising to the youth bulge challenge we face as a continent to work diligently on making the best use of our demographic dividend, as it were, and make the 21st century a truly African century. To put it in the crude form, this is about ridding our societies of hunger and starvation, ensuring food security, and creating job opportunities for all through economic transformation. That's of course why we need to put in place policies that ensure equitable distribution of wealth amongst citizens, or ensuring economic development as opposed to just growth. Hence, a need for a developmental role for the state. While it would be foolhardy to argue that sound political arrangements and economic growth, or even development alone, can in and of themselves rid our countries of all sorts of conflict, thereby ensuring human security, it's nonetheless patently clear that without these two, no important amount of effort can bring us anywhere close to where we want to be in terms of ensuring human security or peace.